what's up everybody? It's Pastor PJ Arsvold with another episode of About That. Now, today I'm finally tackling a topic that was requested a long time ago, and it's an interesting one. I say that about every topic, I think. But they're all interesting, and I wouldn't talk about them if they weren't, I don't think. But this one is on gun control. Now, I kind of teased that this was suggested a while ago, and so that sparked a first video that I made on specifically voting. If you haven't seen that, I encourage you to watch that first. I'll link it up here. The big thing is, as Christians, we have a part of our governance because we live in a democracy. And when we vote, we always vote for the benefit of others. We don't vote for ourselves. That is the last factor. We always vote with what is the best thing for my neighbor, what is the best thing for them, is their total well-being of all their needs and such. So I'm not concerned about me when I vote. We tip the scale, we vote for other people, we vote for our neighbor who might be otherwise overlooked and in need, making sure that they're cared for. This is essential to kind of be on the same page as that when we come to guns, because often when we talk about guns, we think about our rights, and as Christians, we're not concerned about our rights. Now, that doesn't mean we're not concerned about giving rights to other people, or that rights are inherently bad when they're given by our government, but we're not starting with, I want to protect my rights. We're starting with, what is the best thing for my neighbor? And so we're gonna tackle this topic of gun control. I hope this is helpful, as with every video, and I'll say this again at the end. If you have a point, you're like, wait a minute, but you forgot about this, or hey, I'm not sure about that, feel free to comment, feel free to reach out, let's talk about it. Again, these topics are sticky, they're tough, there's not always clean answers, and so I'm gonna do my best to present what I think is a good Christian way to look at the topic of gun control, and I hope that that is helpful. But if there's something that you say, hey, wait a minute, I think we should think about it from this lens, let's talk about it. We want to foster conversation. We want to be able to talk about important things, and we don't want to avoid them just because they're hard or they're divisive. And so hopefully we can get somewhere good as Christians when we talk about this. It's also really helpful to talk about these issues when they're not all over the news. Now, often when we're confronted with realities, it's good to say, hey, how as a Christian do we deal with and comprehend what is happening right now? That's good. But when it comes to divisive topics, especially political topics like gun control, usually it's in reaction to something that has just happened, which, again, it's good to talk about, but usually then we approach conversations already defensive, lines drawn in the sand. And so sometimes it's helpful to kind of talk about these things when they're not so pressing, they're not so emotionally loaded, so we can have a little bit more clarity, a little bit more conversation, a little bit more openness to have a dialogue. So with all of that said, I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about gun control. To start off, we got to talk a little bit about self-defense, because often one of the big reasons people support the right to bear arms is to protect ourselves or our families or loved ones. And so I wanted to start off by reading probably the main passage. If you were to look for a Bible passage that would make a case for self-defense, you would probably look to this passage. So this is Exodus in chapter 22, starting in verse 2. This is from the English Standard Version, in case you're wondering what translation I'm looking at here. In chapter 22, starting in verse 3, not verse 2, God tells the people he's creating laws for them as a civilization. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. And then he goes on to say, if the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it's an ox or donkey or sheep, he shall pay double. So right before this is a law about if you steal from somebody, you get caught, you have to pay back, I think, fivefold. So there's these really real laws about if you break the law, here's how you repay. It's a good reminder that in the Old Testament, God's people are not only a quote-unquote religious people following the one true God, but they're also a civilization, a nation, eventually a kingdom. And so God is laying out, here's what it looks like to live as God's people, as a citizenship as well. Here we have this idea that if somebody is caught breaking into your house at night and kind of in defense, you strike them dead, there's not a penalty, there's no blood guilt for that. This means that when God set up Israel, if somebody breaks in the middle of the night and you respond and you accidentally kill them, you defend yourself, you're not liable for that. However, once the sun comes up, you can see what they have done. It would have been, this is a thief, right? So this is somebody who is stealing. So if it's in the daytime, you can see that they're just stealing stuff. You would report it, you would turn them in, whatever, but you would not kill them. That would be wrong. I would assume the difficulty with at nighttime is you can't tell if this is somebody meant to harm you or if this is somebody who's just stealing stuff. And so there's this command, if they break in at night and you strike them down, there's no penalty. But if it's daytime, basically then they should pay for their actions through the justice system. Turn them over to the right judges, and here's the punishment for that. They have to repay or whatever. So there's this acknowledgement by God in this law that there's times where people are breaking in and there's not a punishment in this situation because out of self-defense, one has defended themselves. And this is a civil law. Now, as Christians, it gets a little tricky. If you look at Jesus, there's times where he actually has his disciples bring along a sword, seemingly for protection, so you'd think there's a weapon. However, you look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus says, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek to them. And the Sermon on the Mount is one that we are very quick as Christians to try and explain away, to explain why we don't actually have to do what Jesus says, because it's hard. So for instance, when Jesus says, if your eye causes you to stumble, cut it out or gouge it out. So do I actually gouge my eye out? I don't see Christians doing that. And so the Sermon on the Mount is tricky, and yet it is maybe the clearest moral imperative of Jesus and what it looks like to be a Christian. And so you have Jesus saying, if somebody were to come up and hit you, you don't defend yourself, you don't retaliate. Instead, you actually allow them, like, all right, you want to hit the other side? You allow them to do it again. Same with stealing. Jesus says if somebody takes your tunic, give them your coat as well. So somebody steals from you, Jesus says, all right, make sure they have the full set, which is just ridiculous for us. And we think, like, that's not common sense. And yet, somehow, some way, that's what Jesus says is this sign of faithfulness, the sign of trust in him that we can in some way almost be taken advantage of for the sake of others. And it's a reminder and a radical witness that we aren't so dependent upon our own pride, our own status, our own possessions, but reliant on God. Now, you can go too far. This is not to tell you that you should go around trying to get hit. This is not to tell you should just go around and lose everything. I think the history of the Christian church, including the apostles, will show that while they weren't violent, they never accumulated and were obsessed with their own possessions. They also didn't lose everything. They didn't always seek to be attacked, but they actually rejoiced when they were attacked. So it's this weird tension of we don't look for pain, we don't look for death, and yet we're not afraid of it when it comes. So all of that is to say, you have these instances where, especially in Exodus 22, where there's this acknowledgement for God's people, hey, if this happens and out of defense, you were to strike somebody dead out of self-defense, there's not a punishment. But you have Jesus saying, if somebody were to attack you, you don't retaliate. Rather, Jesus' own words, turn the other cheek, let him do it again. And Jesus tells his disciples, bring these swords. But then when Peter tries to defend Jesus with his sword, he says, Peter, put the sword away. And so the question is that just a specific instance of Jesus saying, hey, no, this has got to happen, I got to go to the cross? Or is it Jesus saying, no, my people don't handle things this way? So for instance, when Pilate is interviewing Jesus, he says, my kingdom is not of the world. If it was, then my disciples would be fighting for me, right? But they're not. It's a different kind of kingdom. And so Jesus's people are defined in this radical nonviolence, this radical willingness to endure all sorts of suffering for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of their neighbor. Again, not looking to suffer, not trying to make their life miserable, but also not shying away when it happens, or not, taking violent action to oppose it. So hopefully this is a helpful way to think about self-defense. Somebody comes in and they're looking to punch people. Let's just start there, right? Somebody's looking to punch people. You would, if everyone can run away, just do that, right? Maybe you restrain the person. Maybe you have to tackle the person, but you don't want to hurt the person more than is necessary. All right, so as Christians, we don't want to kill, right? Think of the commandments, thou shalt not kill. And I know, too, that word can often be related specifically to murder, and we can talk about when is certain entities or certain people in a position where they're allowed to kill. It's a really tricky situation. But in general, Christians do not want to take human life. And it's not something we seek. Again, not that we're afraid of death as Christians, because Jesus has overcome the grave and we know that we have a resurrection waiting for us. But at the same time, we don't want to take other people's lives. As loving our neighbor, we want to seek their well-being, their welfare, their health, their goodness. But that person who is a threat is also your neighbor. And so that doesn't mean you don't take action against them or you just let them do whatever they want, but it also means that we're seeking their best interest too in some way in the midst of all of it. Now, again, we haven't even talked about guns yet, but I hope what this leads us to is thinking, as a Christian, I want to be very careful whenever I'm in a situation where I could possibly take somebody's life. I do not want to kill people. Now, there are times and situations that get really sticky, that we're faced with difficult decisions, and those are worth talking about. But the long and the short is I want to be very careful giving myself situations where in a moment I could accidentally do something to seriously harm others. One of the dangers of owning a gun is that in a fit of rage, a fit of confusion, in just a moment of panic, we can do a lot of damage to somebody who maybe shouldn't be hurt, right? No, we don't want anyone to be hurt in an ideal world. Let's say there's times where we might use a little bit of force or violence to try and negate what could happen. So somebody comes in looking to hurt people, we might tackle them, risking hurting them a little bit to restrain them. And that's, that might be the right thing to do. But I don't want to do more damage than is necessary. And I don't want to look at somebody, worry that they could be a threat, and then take rash action. So as Christians, we always want to, as much as possible, embody the same nonviolent, sacrificial attitude of Jesus. So this is all to say, it's not inherently wrong to have a gun. I don't think that you could make a case that Christians should never have guns in any situation. I know you think of like some of the Christians who, were living in the wilderness or kind of new areas, and guns can provide safety from animals, which, while God's good creatures, are also in a different place in the order of creation. And so there's something different there. They're not made in God's image. Not that we just want to kill things, trust me. But there might be times when people needed food or needed protection from potentially dangerous animals or threats. So there might be a time for a gun. The reality is that we have war in this world. Sometimes it is a war that is to protect people, what one might call a just war. Sometimes it's very wrong war. Sometimes guns can be used in those situations. But as individual Christians, we just want to be very careful that we are not in a situation where we might accidentally take somebody's life when God has called us to love that person. And especially in situations when they might not be a danger. The scary thing about guns is that they are so good at what they do. So people have always had weapons. But if I have a really big club, it's a lot less likely that I'm going to completely end somebody's life in a rash moment than if I have a gun. It's a lot quicker and easier. And so just as Christians, we want to be careful around guns. We want to be careful about how we think about them, how we use them, what situations we have them in. And as Christians who aren't necessarily, our number one priority isn't ourselves, but as our neighbors, I'm very cautious protecting myself with extreme measures for my own sake. Now, it gets complicated when, I have a wife and kids who depend upon me, and so obviously I don't seek death because that is going to leave them in a tough situation. So in love of my wife and my children, I preserve myself the best I can, but I'm also not afraid because God is still going to protect them. And so even in that situation, we've got to be very careful not to just justify whatever means necessary for self-preservation. It can be really easy. It is a lot easier to find reasons to take whatever action we want than it is to sit with the difficult tensions of living in this messy, sticky world as a Christian. So, on the topic of self-defense, Christians don't necessarily seek our own defense. We might occasionally, out of love for our neighbor, we might seek self-preservation. Again, we don't have to run to danger, but we also aren't afraid of it, and so we wouldn't take crazy measures. If somebody's going to come up and slap you, of course you're not going to punch them, right? Of course you're not going to shoot them. You're not going to take extreme measures. You might do something to try and prevent that person from hurting others, but we're not here to defend ourselves first and foremost. And specifically with guns, we just have to be very careful because guns allow us to be God in a way. Now we can control whether somebody lives or dies a lot easier. It gives a lot of power into our hands. And even as Christians, we are still sinful. Our judgment is sometimes clouded. So we just have to be very, very careful when it comes to what kind of power we're giving ourselves. It's the same in a lot of situations, but it's a wise thing whenever we're faced with potential sins to not put ourselves in situations where we might be tempted to sin or we might fall into sin. If I know that this environment is going to make me prone to relapse and make decisions that hurt my body, then I'm probably not going to put myself in that environment, right? If I know that this is a situation which I might be tempted to do something I shouldn't, I'm going to make sure I have people around me to support me and hold me accountable. And likewise, when it comes to violence, even if we're not a violent person, we just have to make sure we're not giving ourselves situations or the means where we can do a lot of damage or violence unintentionally or in a rash moment or something. We just got to be very, very careful. And one of the hard things is as Christians, when you look at just our country right now, typically Christians are more conservative, and typically conservatives tend to favor access to guns. And I realize that that's sticky. That's just the general trends that I think I see and I think most people see. And I think we just have to be careful as Christians. There are things that we know as Christians that we don't budge on. So as a Christian, I will not budge on the fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now, I'm willing to have a conversation with somebody and let's talk about it and ask questions and be willing to reflect. There are things that God has told us to do. I think the classic example is if I'm married and, one day I'm like, you know what, my wife doesn't really make me happy. God has told me not to divorce her for that reason. And my happiness is not the most important thing. And so I'm not going to budge on that. I can talk about it, but I'm not, that I know for certain. But with some things like guns, sometimes Christians act like it is a given. And I think that with any of these topics, whether you are somebody who is in favor of access to guns or in favor of gun control, we need to be willing and able to have a conversation. We need to be able and willing to open up those things that God has not clearly revealed and hold them a little bit more loosely. I'm willing to challenge them. Sadly, there often falls like kind of two camps in our country, in our world, and there's kind of a prescribed set of beliefs for each group, and it's really easy to just say, all right, here's what we believe, and they all go together. But as Christians, we are going to find some resonance with one side, we're going to find some resonance with another. Sometimes we're going to find resonance with neither and say, no, neither of you are right on this topic. God has called us to something different. So that's just to say we need to be able to hold things a little bit loosely and willing to actually have conversation from a Christian perspective. And this is why it's so important to have good conversations, to be willing to open ourselves up, to hear feedback, not just so we can respond, but to actually consider it. And then hopefully we can get somewhere better, more Christ-like as we go forward. So finally, on the topic of gun control itself, we've talked about self-defense and guns a little bit, just briefly on gun control. Because this is where obviously the conversation usually comes up is, should we ban guns? Should we allow guns? Stuff like that. As I said in the voting video, we all have a role, we have a responsibility, whether you like it or not, to have some say in gun control. The people you elect have influence on these kind of things. The people who we place in positions of power, we vote for, people and policies that we voice and advocate for. We have a responsibility. That's part of living in a democracy. And if you don't like it, you can go to a not democracy. But for now, we live in a democracy, and so we have a responsibility to partake in the governance of this country with the responsibility that we're given as citizens and as voters. So what I'll say on this is, as I said in the voting video, our votes are always for others. So when I approach the topic of gun control, my first question is not, do I want guns? My first question is not, I'm uncomfortable with guns, and what do I do with that? My first question is, what's the best thing for my neighbor? What's the best thing for our country? And we need to step outside of our own needs, our own wants. It's not to say that I know I have loved ones who really enjoy hunting, who really enjoy going to a shooting range. I have loved ones who wish that we could just take away every gun right now, and just strip them clean. No more guns in our country. And we just have to be careful again that our starting point is not, what do I want? My starting point is not, what am I comfortable with? But my starting point is, what is the best thing for my neighbor, which in this case is everyone who lives in the United States, who comes and visits here, all of the above, really. So I approach the topic thinking, what is the best thing for my neighbor? And then you get into this messy thing about policy, right? So I'm voting and I'm helping determine what our laws are. And so here's where there's a lot of middle ground, a lot of gray area that we should be able to talk about. Are we going to allow weapons? If so, what kind of weapons? If so, what kind of regulations do we put on this? We need to be able, at every layer of this conversation, ask ourselves, what is the best thing for my neighbor? Should we allow weapons of any sort, right? Anything that could cause damage. Well, does a fork cause damage? All right, so we're gonna allow some things that could be used as a weapon. All right, so what's the level? Okay, we're gonna allow this, but not this. And we're always thinking, what's the best thing for my neighbor? What's the best thing? If we're gonna allow people to have access to these things, what damage can it cause? What good can it cause? All of the above. What are the pros and cons of each side? And we consider, we reflect on as Christians. Again, not worried about ourselves, not worried about necessarily our own protection per se, not that we don't protect ourselves, but the sake of my neighbor, my loved ones, my fellow citizens, fellow people who live in this country. So then we ask all these questions with a lens of what's the best thing for my neighbor, and then we think about what's practical, what actually works. Now, practical is dangerous. We never want what's practical to override what's right, but there's a reality that we live in a messy world. So let's say you wanted no guns in this country, and tomorrow you're like, let's ban all guns. Well, the reality is that there's a lot of guns in people's hands. And so the question is an outright ban of all weapons, and let's say we're trying to confiscate all guns, would that work? I mean, would it be effective? Would that cause more violence to occur as a retaliation? These are all things that we have to consider and look out for. And it's tough. We live in a messy, sticky world. But this is where creativity and cooperation and ideas really have a chance to flourish. I recently read Pele, the really good soccer player. I read his autobiography. And he talks about in Brazil a really low education rate. It was really hard, especially in areas of high poverty. Kids didn't go to school much. And so you could approach that situation by making school mandatory, and you could punish parents if they don't send their kid to school. And that would be one way to try and address the problem. But what's interesting, this group worked alongside Pele to help raise money and build sporting complexes at school. So soccer fields, I think basketball courts, stuff like that. And what they found is then there was a motivation for kids to come to school because then they were able to play these sports. And so they'd see Pele playing, world soccer or football, depending on where you're at, and wanted to be like him. And then the best soccer field in the area was at the school, and so you'd have to go to school to play on the soccer field. And so what they found is this kind of ingenious idea of building sporting complexes in schools was a way to help bring education to kids who otherwise wouldn't get this education. And so even when we're looking at policy, it's not always as clear as like, should people have guns or not, but how do we go about enacting something? How do we go about creating an environment, creating the end result that is the best for my neighbor, that is the best for the people of this country? And so it's sticky, it's muddy, and it takes a lot of cooperation, which unfortunately many people aren't willing to do these days. And so as Christians, we have a chance to be a voice of reason, to kind of be in the middle. The hard thing about being in the middle is, no pun intended, you take crossfire from both sides, because you're never going to find yourself completely in one camp. But we're able to kind of bridge a gap and say, hey, I hear what you're saying. Hey, I hear what you're saying. Let's talk about this. And that doesn't mean that neither side is completely wrong or completely right, or that it's a perfect 50-50, but we need to be able to facilitate conversation around these tough topics and hopefully move towards a better place when it comes to guns and all topics, all political topics, for all people who call this place their home. I'll just say this too, God's will is ultimately what's most important. And so when we have laws, one of the cool things is that we can change them. And this is again where it gets sticky, right? So our Bill of Rights have certain rights that our country said, these are the rights of our country. There's nothing in Christianity that would prevent us from using the appropriate channels to change those rights. At the same time, you open a door when you do that, right? So as Christians, we even ask ourselves, all right, so we have these constitutional rights. Do we want to open the door on changing these? If we do, we realize that there might be less stability. That might not be good. But if we think that changing this constitutional right would be of a benefit to the majority of people, it might be worth it. And so let's just say, this is again where it's so complex. That's why you can't just have a simple like, oh, the Christian answer is this without anything else. It needs to be in conversation. It needs to be ongoing. We need to put our heads together. We need to challenge one another. We need to but challenge each other in a way that's supportive and productive, because ultimately we're working towards the betterment of the creation, the betterment of humanity through the channels he's given us. So even things like constitutional rights can be changed. God, nowhere in the Bible says that God has given us a right to anything. So our rights are given to us by the places and the nations we live in, which is great. I appreciate the rights that we have. But if we think that a different right is better or that right isn't necessary, there's nothing unchristian about possibly changing that, using the right means, of course. But ultimately, we don't want to let political policy get in the way of God's good work. If we have a policy that says this, that goes against God's will, we go with God's will, while also respecting the authorities that he's put in place. Again, it's sticky, it's messy. I realize this is a lot, it's a little bit scatterbrained because it's such a complex topic, but I hope what you take away from this is, as Christians, we got to be careful justifying any use of force just for the sake of self-defense. While there might be situations where we use some force or violence, we got to be slow to that. We want to be careful. We, especially with guns, we want to be careful giving ourselves almost like a godlike ability to end somebody's life so quickly. Also, the idea of guns, the idea of suicide is a really big thing to consider. If you want to talk more about that, talk to me sometime, but there's, I think, some really compelling reasons to think that guns contribute to successful suicide attempts. So as people who, again, care about human life, what are we doing to help our neighbor? So that's something to consider. And then actually enacting policy, it's sticky, it's messy, it takes a lot of conversation, compromise, working through with the end goal in mind of the betterment of our neighbor. All of this is to say, you are not the most important thing. And yet in God's eyes, you are a priceless treasure. And so when you go into the world, you live with God's eyes, seeing other people as priceless treasures who are more honorable and valuable than yourself. And we were recently in a meeting as a staff. We were talking about seeking the betterment of our city or the civilization we live in. And somebody brought up a really good point. And they said, if everyone were to seek the betterment of those around them, you would never have to seek your own betterment because somebody else would be looking out for you. And it's so spot on. And so as Christians, our view is always outward, always how can I be a blessing to others, never how can I get the best thing for me, what do I want? But again, it's sticky. There's no clean-cut answer. There's a lot of conversation. And I hope this is just a launching point for future discussions. I don't want this to be the mic drop, end-all be-all. Rather, I hope this can foster some good, meaningful reflection. So if you want to talk about this more, you want to talk about guns or gun control, voting, other social issues, and how Christians should approach them. It's all good, it's all challenging, but it's worth talking about, and God has a lot to say about all of these things. Our faith touches every part of our life. So if you want to talk more about that, reach out to me. We can find up a time to chat, exchange emails, meet up for coffee, something like that. If you have another topic you want to throw out there, there's a link down in the description where you can submit other ideas. I'm always looking for things that people are concerned about or wondering about. This was a submitted idea, and so I'm thankful that somebody decided that we should broach this. If you want to push back, feel free. If you could do nice, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'll still take feedback and criticism any way that you wish to express it. Again, we want to foster good conversation though. And I just encourage you to do that. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and have a blessed time. See you later.